Good morning, everyone. This is Randy Swaty, ecologist with the Nature Conservancy's LANDFIRE team. I'm located up in Marquette, Michigan, in the middle of a polar vortex. It was around -15 when I drove to work this morning. And I'm pleased to be presenting the first in a three-part webinar series hosted by your fire consortia, the Pacific Northwest Fire Science Consortia. Today I'll be introducing LANDFIRE, and then on February 26th, Ryan Hualgo, forest ecologist with the Nature Conservancy, will be talking about how he uses LANDFIRE products to assess restoration needs in Pacific Northwest forests. On March 26th, Corey Blankenship, my colleague located in Bend, Oregon, will be talking about how to customize and localize LANDFIRE data. So the registration information is located in the webinar series announcement, which we can get to you, and those dates will be also on the last slide I present. So thanks again. I wanted to let you know I believe you all are muted, just to keep the sound nice. Use the chat to ask any questions. I'll be tracking that as I go along, and it helps me in case I'm confusing someone if you go ahead and type your questions there so I can address them as they come up. Also, I want to apologize. I have a little bit of a cough. So if you hear me go on mute for a second, I'm probably coughing. So thanks again, and off we go. Really appreciate your participation today and with future LANDFIRE webinars. So here's today's agenda. I'll let you read that as I make a few comments here. I'm hoping that you'll be inspired and stunned at the end of this presentation. I know it sounds a little far-fetched or maybe lofty, but you know, the data sets we have here, the maps constantly inspire me, and the work that you all do with the data sets and the models and the creativity is just outstanding. So I'm hoping that'll be the case. LANDFIRE has been around for roughly 10 years, so I'm guessing most of you have heard of it. I'm hoping to shake you into thinking about not only LANDFIRE but all, data sets in general, models in general, and hoping that, together we can start using all the amazing data in the best way possible to make the best decisions on the ground. As we like to say, LANDFIRE is about more than fire. There's so much you can do with the tools and data. We do have to go over some nuts and bolts, no doubt. And if you're a geek, these alone will move you to explore LANDFIRE, I hope. But if you're not a geek, put on your thinking cap, your creative cap, and we'll see what we can come up with. So what is LANDFIRE? I'm going to introduce it in a few ways. Here's one, and from this slide I want you to take away three things. LANDFIRE is a partnership, and I really believe that this should always be first in our conversations. You see that there's some logos at the bottom. There's no way we could capture all the people who have contributed to LANDFIRE. Many of you are among those contributors, so we thank you for that. LANDFIRE is academics, private consultants, agency workers, students, NGOs, and more. Second, you see maps in a model diagram on here. This is only part of the story. LANDFIRE is about people, ideas, being creative, and making the most of current products available to us. We do, I would say, difficult work, especially you guys out in the field making decisions on large landscapes, and we have to use the best information we can. Also note the word vegetation. While named LANDFIRE, the program is not only about solving fire-related issues, but also about broader vegetation and values that are connected to it. Okay, another attempt at introducing this thing called LANDFIRE. Okay, more official language you see. As you're reading this, I'll tell you about my first job out of graduate school. I worked with large industrial landowners, paper producers, and my job was to help them talk to each other and cooperate at a landscape scale. I studied esoteric things such as community genetics and mycorrhizal fungi in school. At least my forester friends always thought it was esoteric. And while I was doing it, I assumed all this basic ecological work had been done. You see maps around. I thought all the country had been mapped in multiple ways, and all the vegetation metrics have been mapped. I thought we had great descriptions of how our ecosystems would work under natural disturbance regimes. I was wrong, and it made our work at a landscape scale here in Michigan very difficult. We had a lot of information, but some of it was confidential. Some of it came from sources and made it really difficult to piece together. So I was really excited when I learned about LANDFIRE and jumped at the chance to participate. I'm constantly amazed by the data sets and descriptive projects. They can make a real difference in landscape management. I learned that firsthand in working with these industrial landowners. So I probably sound like a politician, as I have not yet really told you what LANDFIRE is. Here's the reason I'm being vague. I find if I tell people that LANDFIRE is about data sets, that's what they focus on. If I talk about models, they focus on that. It's it's a broad, comprehensive program aimed to help land managers with fire and vegetation management. And if I just tell you it was about data, I might limit your thoughts or constrain your imagination. So I'm going to try a music analogy on you, as I'm trying to move past the box thing. You know, LANDFIRE can be like elevator music. If you're a fire program, if you're an FBA analyst or a budget analyst and you have to use LANDFIRE data, it might be like being stuck on an elevator with elevator music. You know, and you wish you could use something different, you get it stuck in your head and off you go. Or for some folks, using LANDFIRE data is almost like being a jazz musician. You have some basic constraints, maybe the scales, the time signatures, but you can draw from all other musical inspirations to piece together your solo. So I'm hoping that you'll think of LANDFIRE that way. We need to know the scales, so to speak. We need to know what the constraints are in using LANDFIRE data and models. But from there, it's basically, you know, trying to address the questions at hand with the information we have. So to try to demonstrate LANDFIRE a little bit to you, I'm going to split things up into aspatial and spatial components. One of the aspatial or non-map, non-GIS data components of LANDFIRE are the models. And I'll go into those a little bit. The Nature Conservancy had a cooperative agreement to describe and model reference conditions for the ecosystems. And so we tried to capture how the ecosystems of the U.S. looked and worked prior to settlement. To do this, the Nature Conservancy ran dozens of workshops with hundreds of experts, again, including some of you, I assume, who first described these ecosystems, then modeled the disturbances to get an estimate of how much of each developmental stage or succession class would be on the landscape. The models and descriptions were reviewed, QC'd, and are available to you at the link below, which will be available to you later as a PDF. And also, this webinar is being recorded, so you can check it out there. And I'll note also that the model components, there's new that are available to you, GIS data sets and descriptions that are useful. So more about these models. The models look like this. Using Vegetation Dynamics Development Tool, which has since been replaced by software called STSIM, we entered in the parameters of those succession classes, which are represented in the green box here. Up to 5 for each ecosystem. Then the natural disturbance regimes and their impacts. These natural disturbances include 3 types of fire: wind, flooding, insects, and can also include user-defined disturbances such as beaver herbivory. And you'll note that when we did our reference condition work, those were all natural disturbances. So it didn't include invasives or logging or prescribed fire or fire suppression. These are state and transition models that quantify the rates and pathways for succession and the probability of disturbance under pre-settlement reference conditions. These models are accompanied by the description document that describes their site characteristic, species, geographic ranges for each biophysical setting, or BPS. Okay, I'm going to take a quick break. It sounds like there are some sound issues. Interesting. Is it getting better? Okay, thanks everyone. I appreciate you guys typing in the chat comments so I can track what's going on. I've replugged in my headset, and honestly, my internet connection here at the office, that's probably the issue. So hopefully that won't happen again. But thanks for pointing that out. To help illustrate how we use these reference conditions and to help you visualize how it kind of looks, here's a graph depicting reference conditions for the succession classes of a western hemlock ecosystem and current conditions. So each succession class is sort of defined by canopy cover, which I have generically described as open or closed here, but it's delivered in 10% increments. Tree height and the species that occur in that succession class. So in this western hemlock, you see that under reference conditions, most of this ecosystem would have been in this late succession class with closed canopy, tall trees. Today we see that most of the western hemlock in this example is in the earlier succession class, closed canopy, shorter trees. So LANDFIRE uses these data to calculate what's called vegetation departure. Excuse me, you may use the data to help set a desired future condition. You may add in new succession classes that are present on the landscape today, or you may like things just as they are based on your biodiversity or social and economic values on your landscape. This is also note too that while LANDFIRE calls these reference conditions, they are not meant to be taken as a prescription for what you have to do on your landscape. Excuse me. Obviously, this does not include climate change and other factors on the ground. So while it's really useful data and useful information, I don't want to present it as if it's a prescription definitely what should be your desired future condition. That's up for you to decide. So remember the website I showed you earlier? Here's what it leads to. If you drill into landfire.gov and you go into the vegetation button, on the right hand you'll see the vegetation models, and you click in the US map here based on a map zone. LANDFIRE delivers its data and products via map zones. And you get a PDF document, and you also get an access database that's used by the modeling software. Excuse me. So here's kind of what the model descriptions look like in PDF form. Eventually, we hope to move the descriptions to a different format that's easier to search and interact with, but right now you get all the ecosystems or biophysical settings for a map zone, and you just use the search function in Adobe to find the ecosystem you're looking for. So that's the model descriptions, and I want to summarize things here. The models represent how the ecosystems of the U.S. looked and worked prior to European settlement. There's two parts that you need to be aware of. You can today get the PDFs and look through the descriptions and learn about your ecosystems. And tomorrow, it's pretty simple. You could get the Access database and start playing around in Vegetation Dynamics Development Tool. Seriously, that's probably some of the funnest modeling you could do. It's fairly simple. You could go in and turn off fire in 4 clicks and see what that does to your ecosystem. It's not a prescription, as I mentioned. The models can be hacked, and I mean that in a positive way. They can be customized or modified easily. And they're not rocket science to model or to modify. It's something we could do a webinar like this, and we could interact with the software, and I could get you up and running in no time. We're happy to do that. So on to the spatial data, which I'm assuming most people are a little more familiar with. And if you will, I'm going to hit my mute for a moment and give you a minute to type in any questions before we move on to the spatial data sets. Okay, thank you. So this is a sampling, I'll say, of the LANDFIRE products that are delivered for your spatial enjoyment. We break them up into 4 categories here, and I'm going to give you some examples of these data sets in a moment, but you can check these out. I'm going to describe quickly for you some that may not have the most intuitive names. The biophysical settings we've just spoken about, and that represents the vegetation that would be on the landscape prior to European settlement, based on soils, soil drainage, slope, aspect, elevation, climate, those sorts of things. And it also includes disturbance. So environmental site potential is what would occur on a site without disturbance, sort of your habitat type or your climax vegetation. That was developed mostly as a step to create the biophysical settings. LANDFIRE wanted to move past the idea of climax vegetation. As we know, ecosystems are very dynamic and don't get stuck in a climax situation. So the biophysical settings tries to get at that. Also, within the biophysical settings are descriptions of succession classes, and those are mapped, and there you'll see that under the fire regime category. They're mapped, as I mentioned, based on species, cover, percent canopy cover, and canopy height. Also, you'll notice the fuel data sets, which I'm assuming you guys are more familiar with than I am. And also, one of the fabulous data sets that we have out now is disturbance. And you'll notice I need to bring this up to date. I should have done this morning. We now have up to 2010 for disturbance. It says 2008. So we'll go into the refresh process in a moment, but the data has been refreshed. And this disturbance represents modern disturbances on the landscape, and I'll go into that in more detail as well. Okay, so there's a great question about the vegetation dynamics models, and as I mentioned, that runs off an Access database. Also, there's a reference database which includes those descriptions. I rarely mention that because we don't have any support really for that reference database, but if you want to interact with what we call the reference or the model tracker database, that's available to you as well, so that you get the descriptions to the models in an Access database as well. So thanks for that question. It looks like another question's coming in, so I'm gonna stay here for a moment. I think we're okay on time. Yes. I'm curious. I hope you guys can all see the questions that are coming in. Kevin asks about the disturbance layer, and I'm going to go into that in more detail, but basically, yes, we depend on your submissions for mapping disturbances, but we also do some change detection. And LANDFIRE does mine all the federal and other disturbance databases to map disturbances. And there's a question about downloading the full PDF for biophysical settings descriptions. And that's on landfire.gov. If you drill into the vegetation button, and then you'll see a table that will have vegetation models, and you can drill into there to get the descriptions. And they'll be delivered again by map zone. So some of them may be 300 pages, and you'll have to just use the find or search function in Adobe to get to your ecosystem of interest. So thanks for the questions. I appreciate it. I'm going to show you some characteristics of the data and a few examples from your part of the world. All right, we show this map. This is percent departure for the country, a map developed by Sarah Hagen. And this is using some older data. But the reason I put this up here is to show you that LANDFIRE data is wall to wall. That's one of the incredible parts for me. Where I live, formerly we had data in Minnesota, some data in Wisconsin, some data in Michigan. And it was really hard to mash them together to get a regional perspective. So now we can do this with LANDFIRE data. The data is integrated, meaning it all works together fairly well. You know, all the attribute tables can line up, and so it's fairly easy to work with. The data is delivered as 30-meter pixels designed for use across large areas. And here I'm going to point out my favorite pixel syndrome that people fall into. As I move on to the next map, what people love to do is treat vegetation data like it's a roadmap, something that's been around for decades, that is almost always right. Our vegetation data is getting better and better all the time, but LANDFIRE data is, excuse me, it's meant to be used at a large scale. So, you know, if you drill in, well, this happens to me. I'll show somebody a map. They'll drill into their favorite pixel, that stand they've been managing for 30 years. If LANDFIRE mapped it as pine oak instead of oak, they'll ditch the data set. I encourage you not to do that. I do encourage you to review the data, but review it at the appropriate scale and learn about the data and drill in and modify it as needed. Or use your own local data if that's what you have and it works really well. But for LANDFIRE data, I encourage you to use it at a large scale. So here's LANDFIRE existing vegetation type data representing NatureConserv's ecological systems, a mid-scale classification. And there's a question about Alaska. Yes, we do have data for Alaska. Sorry that wasn't on the previous map. We have data for Hawaii and the insular islands as well. So thanks for that question. Here's a map of LANDFIRE existing vegetation cover, and you'll see it's delivered in 10% increments by herbaceous, shrub, and tree. And also there's some other categories in there as well, such as herbaceous wetlands and agriculture. Okay, Carl asked a great question for assessing accuracy. And this is sort of, I should put a graph depicting this. The smaller of area you get, the more review you need, is how I think of it. So I'm going to be a politician again and say that I hate to give you any numbers, but I'll give you some examples. Here in Upper Peninsula, where I live, we've drilled into the data a lot, and we know the strengths and weaknesses. We've compared it to local data where we have it, and I'm okay using it at 100,000 acres, but that's after a fair amount of review. And our national forests here will now use it to pinpoint areas for further work. You know, so it's sort of a watershed to watershed view. You may find that as you drill in, it works beautifully, and you can just go on and use it for finer scale work. But again, it was designed for watershed to watershed, and I would love to explore the data with any of you for your area. We have some YouTube videos with suggestions on how to review and modify your data, and we'd love to do that with you if you like. We have experience with the strengths and weaknesses in various parts of the country, and can hook you up with locals who have used the data and understand what it's best suited for and where it may need some modification. So thanks for that question. Here's LANDFIRE existing vegetation height. It's similarly delivered by herbaceous, shrub, and forest, and you see the height breakdowns. In my part of the world, you know, I don't mind pointing out to you that we have a lot of trees that are in this area around 25 meters, and depending on the site, conditions, right over 25 meters might be a really, can start to be considered an older growth tree if it's on a lower site potential place. And trees 25 meter on a high site potential might be, middle succession class. So you have to be aware of these height breakdowns and act appropriately. So when you mash those data sets together, so to speak, and you use the rule sets and the biophysical settings descriptions, you come up with succession classes. So again, succession classes are a mix of the vegetation composition, cover, and height. And I'll caution you, LANDFIRE does not always go in a linear fashion. So while succession class A is consistently the first developmental stage in an ecosystem after a replacement event, succession class E is not necessarily closed canopy, tall, old trees. So you have to read the descriptions to understand what the succession classes are. People like to do that as well. Go from A to E in a linear fashion, thinking that E is always the oldest, and that's not always the case. This is one of my favorite data sets. These are historic fire regime groups, and there's 5 of them. So they range from more frequent, less severe, and move on to fire regime group 5, which are areas that rarely have that have a much longer fire return interval. So these capture severity and frequency of fire historically, and I love looking at them, and I think there's a lot of useful information. This comes from the biophysical settings descriptions. So again, you can go in and learn more about these areas specifically by zooming in as appropriate, reading the descriptions. But wow, it's a beautiful data set in my mind and very illustrative. In the Midwest, for example, using these data sets, we can calculate annual acres burned historically. We can mine our data sets, and that's really fun to give us a baseline of what used to happen here. So a summary: dozens of 30-meter pixel rasters developed and delivered, large-scale work, and I didn't present this, but one of the most used data sets is the topographic data set. So that's available as well. I think people use it because it spans states and it's easy to work with. And I'm going to pause here for a moment. You can crank out questions if you like. Okay, thanks for that. The data are updated, so now I'm going to quickly go through some refresh information. And this is another, I think, novel and great aspect of LANDFIRE. It's not static. This table, which is available online as well, provides an overview of the major versions of LANDFIRE. In LANDFIRE 2001, for example, we focused on improving methods for mapping existing vegetation cover and height. In 2008, we updated the products using change detection and information on disturbance and succession to map a circa 2008 condition. So as you imagine when we're mapping the whole country, there's always a lag time. So we just delivered LANDFIRE 2010, and that's available for the country. Most products are available in most places now. And so what happens is they take the 2008 data and bring it up to 2010 conditions. And I'm going to go into some more detail here. Sorry, I didn't realize this was animated. Okay, so LANDFIRE used change detection, as I mentioned, and analyzed roughly 4,300 Landsat scenes for change in the conterminous US alone. So in addition to submitted plot data, they also did a lot of change detection work. Wildland-fire databases were mined, such as MTBS, the Burned Area Reflectance Classification database, the Rapid Assessment of Vegetation Condition After Wildfire database, the Burned Area Emergency Response, and others. Also, I'll put a plug in. The more plot data we have, the better. So anytime you can submit information, it's much appreciated. And in my part of the world, and I'm sure you have analogs, if someone does a single tree harvest selection or single tree selection harvest, LANDFIRE might not be able to pick that up via change detection. So we would rely on plot data to pick up that potential change in succession class. Yes. So there's some questions coming in. Yes, so the 2010 data has refreshed data up through 2010. Moving into this coming summer, 2012 data will start to come out. And there's a question I cannot answer. Unfortunately, if someone else wants to chime in, what's the difference between the GNN and LANDFIRE regarding vegetation types? Looks like Jim Smith's going to jump in there. I'm not familiar with that acronym, so thanks, Jim. So there's a database that was generated to help mappers decide how to transition data or vegetation type, cover, and height from one type to the next. So if you have a ponderosa pine forest closed canopy and there's a replacement event, that would move it back to probably a herbaceous type and or succession class A within that ponderosa pine type. So it's a very complex refresh process. These guys, I don't do any of this. I watch in amazement as they use the vegetation transition database, plot data, remote sensing to update the data. So coming up in a few years, we'll start a total remap, which will be more comprehensive, more in-depth than these remapping, refreshing processes. Also, for you guys who work in Guam or the Virgin Islands, I'm sure it would be, those are places I'm dreaming of right now as it's 5 below outside. We have data for those areas as well. And I'm sorry I didn't have Hawaii and Alaska on one of my earlier maps. We have data for those locations as well. As you've probably gleaned from my comments, LANDFIRE plus users equal better products. You guys are really key to making LANDFIRE data the best it can be. And as you might imagine, we use FIA data. We used basically in LANDFIRE National, we used over 800,000 georeference plot locations, many of which came from the user community. So you guys are really important. The plots are the foundation of our maps, and with a few exceptions at the start of the project, LANDFIRE does not collect plot data. We gather plots from existing data sources and you guys. You guys can also provide feedback. To the extent possible, we incorporate user feedback to improve maps, not to just update them over time. In 2001, those changes were largely a result of user feedback. So this map shows the databases and plots compiled for LANDFIRE National, sort of the original data set, if you will. Since LANDFIRE National, we've acquired more vegetation and fuel plot data, but most of it has been archived to use in future remap. So thanks to you all who submit plot data. It's really important to us and to our user community. And it looks like there's a great chat going on, and it looks like you guys are addressing the LANDFIRE GNN data question. So I'm going to let you guys run with that while I move on to the next slide. And I'll keep on watching the chat window as well in case there are other questions I'm more informed about. So LANDFIRE is used in a number of different types of applications. Just today I got a Google Scholar alert with 3 more papers, peer-reviewed journal articles, where researchers had used LANDFIRE data. We have what we call the WHAM, maybe my favorite acronym to date which stands for the Web Hosted Application Map, exclamation point, of course. And these are just some of the places and stories we know of where people are using LANDFIRE data. We love to collect your stories. Most of these are non-fire at this point, though we're going to add in fire. Although some of them, if they're novel or large-scale fire assessment, that's there and there as well. So I encourage you on your lunch hour to go to this website. Excuse me. And you can also just Google LANDFIRE and wham with an exclamation point, and you'll get to this map. It's no means complete, and again, we're going to add in more fire over time. And the goal of this is to transfer lessons learned. People are doing great stuff with the data. They're learning how to modify it. They're learning the limits and how to stretch it for all it's worth. So thanks to you guys who are developing stories in the Pacific Northwest, and connect us to those when you can. Another great source of information is the Conservation Gateway. This is the Nature Conservancy's LANDFIRE web presence. Our site has depth and offers a broad selection of resources, including information on models, spatial data, application stories, and case studies, in a map section, with the WHAM, of course, and other static map as well. There's a library with dozens of papers where people have used LANDFIRE. There's presentations, links, reference materials, current postings and announcements, and links to videos and tutorials. So, we are available as people to help you at any time, and I love doing that. I love learning what people are doing on the ground, and love trying to help people use the data and models. But you can also go to the gateway to really learn a lot about LANDFIRE. The gateway is easy access, and these are some of the most used pages that we kind of illustrate for you today. According to Google Analytics, these are the 4 hotspots that attract the most visitors. The homepage, of course, is the starting point and overview. Then people look for applications, they search the library, they use support and training videos. This site works in concert with landfire.gov. Landfire.gov being the basic delivery system. Our site is not the engine that runs the software, tools, and data, but is an easy access entry point for many who need to know more about LANDFIRE. So definitely go to landfire.gov, check that out. That's where you would learn about the data specifically, get metadata and descriptions. Then you can jump to the gateway to learn about how people use the data. We also have other sources of information, which I'll show you in a moment. But I want to summarize things. It's I could just combine words, kind of like on your refrigerator magnet thing. It's a living repository, a huge program, a huge repository delivering a living community. All those words fit, and I think you can put them together how you want. Maybe we should have a contest and develop maybe a T-shirt or something. But it's reference conditions, it's spatial data, it's dozens if not hundreds of research and other papers, tutorials, documentation, and updates. It's changing, growing, developing. It's not a static program. Here's the Nature Conservancy's LANDFIRE team. We have, I show you this partly for the fun of it, but it also say we have a wide range of experience. We have Jim Smith, who's worked in academia and for large industrial forest management companies. We have Corey Blankenship, who's in Bend, Oregon. She's a former hotshot, great with GIS data, and has been around LANDFIRE since almost the beginning. Myself, I'm an ecologist in Michigan. I went to school in Arizona, so I understand some of your Western ecosystems. We have Sarah Hagen, who's a GIS analyst and loves to work across the country doing analyst GIS work. We also have Jeannie Patton, who you guys are probably most familiar with. She runs our Twitter page, our Conservation Gateway, She helped work with Janine to set this webinar series up, and she would love to help you tell your stories of how you use LANDFIRE data. So for more information, you can go to these sites. And again, we're going to make this all available to you. But sometimes the easiest way is just to Google. So you can always Google LANDFIRE and Twitter, go to YouTube, and we have a YouTube channel that's fairly well populated with some in-depth GIS, raster modification tutorials, introductions. And I'm sorry about the font at the bottom, but I want to mention that if you contact landfire@tnc.org, you can receive LANDFIRE newsletters, and again, you can receive them when you want, or we can not send them when you want. We're not spam, though we want to keep people updated as to what's happening. And finally, before we open things up for more questions, which I'm very keen to try to answer, I want to remind you of the next 2 webinars in this series. And while you're reminding yourself of those, I want to sincerely thank you for your participation, with your patience with my cough, your questions and discussion in the chat room. And with that, I'm very happy to open it up to more questions or comments, ideas, suggestions. And as I mentioned, we'll make the slides available via PDF, and this has been recorded for your future pleasure. So thanks so much, and I'll watch for questions in the chat room. Thanks for the questions that are on their way. It looks like there's a little bit of a lag between when you type and when I get the questions. Okay. All right, some questions. Hey, Jeannie or Janine, will you please correct the April 2nd?
Yeah,
All right, sorry about that.
It is April 2nd. We apologize. We had to change the date once it went out, once the announcements were made. But it is April 2nd, the same time as this. And all of the announcements about this that are going out now are have the correct date. So if you registered for the March 26th one, you're still registered for the April 2nd one. You use the same link. Okay?
Hey, thanks so much for that clarification. There's a great question about disturbances. Thanks for that question. Basically asking if future versions will separate out prescribed fire and wildfire. And Jim Smith or others, if you want to kick in, you can. I doubt it. I think that the disturbance categories will probably stay the same for a while, though I'm not positive about that. So I would appreciate other answers on that. Classification. Okay, classification for mapping at. What I'm going to say here, Cabby, is I would want to look at your landscape and review things a bit, and then we could drill into the existing vegetation type attribute table. There's a number of crosswalks and attributes in the existing vegetation type data set that we can look at. Of course, obviously, it's nice to use the finest scale possible if the data holds up to it. But I think I'm sorry, I can't answer that directly without looking at the data for you. Lee Elliott, great question. Will there be updates to the modeling and reference databases, the non-spatial data? We are working on, we've been sort of approved, if you will, to do a review of the biophysical settings. And what we're proposing to do right now is to basically clean things up. So it's not a full-on review. We won't be redoing them. It's going to be, I guess you could think of it as an in-depth QA, QC, and in making the biophysical settings, models, and descriptions easier to use and just cleaner. I am hoping that when LANDFIRE does the remap, that we will be able to do a more in-depth review of the BPS models and descriptions. And so Jim Smith, I don't know if you see what he's typed here. The latest version of LANDFIRE has prescribed fire, he thinks, but we're going to check to make sure. Corey may be able to answer that. I haven't looked at it for a little bit. Looks like Curtis Nelson will probably be supplying an answer too. He's from Eros and a high caliber LANDFIRE development person, so he might be able to dig in there a little bit. Okay, so Curtis informs us that current LANDFIRE disturbance data layers do differentiate where possible, and if known, disturbance falls into a generic wildland fire class. That makes sense. Thanks, Curtis, for helping us out there.
Are there any other questions? It doesn't look like it. So thank you, Randy, very much. Take care of your cold. And
Hey, thanks so much.
oh, and thank you all for attending this webinar, and hope to see you um, virtually in the at the February 26th webinar, assessing needs using LANDFIRE products. And that'll, again, will be at the same time, 9 o'clock Pacific time, with Ryan Haugo. So we hope to see you all then. And I think I saw David Seaschultz typing something there. And there's Randy's, nothing more. Okay, thanks, David. And there's Randy's email for folks. So, all right, thank you very much. And we'll go ahead and end this webinar. Here's more information.
Are you still on the phone?